In the United States of America, at the age of 71, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who actively promoted the so-called crippling sanctions against Russia, has passed away. A day before his death, he stood in Kiev holding a Ukrainian interceptor drone and promised President Zelensky, quote, to kick Putin's ass. A day later, he was carried out of his own house on a stretcher. Lindsey Graham, a senator who visited war-torn Ukraine 10 times and the author of those same crippling sanctions that were supposed to strangle Russian oil, left this world on the evening of July 11 at the age of 71. Officially, it was a sudden illness. According to NBC, emergency services responded to a call about cardiac arrest. And almost instantly, the Russian information space just exploded. Russians immediately started writing that, by some strange coincidence, he met with Zelensky and died. In this episode, we'll break everything down honestly. What is known about Lindsey Graham's death according to the facts? What theories, from reasonable to outright absurd, are already circulating online? Why was Lindsey Graham so important for Ukraine? And what did he actually do for it? And why? His relationship with Trump. This is a whole separate drama that now directly affects the fate of sanctions against Russia. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel. We're moving towards 300,000 subscribers, so I would really appreciate your subscription. So, let's start with what is definitely known. The senator's office reported, quote, on the evening of Saturday, July 11, U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham passed away after a brief and sudden illness. NBC News adds some details here. And so, according to an audio recording of a police radio transmission, emergency services arrived at Lindsey Graham's home on Capitol Hill in response to a call about cardiac arrest, and later, the medics' communications indicated that cardiopulmonary resuscitation was being performed. Photos from the scene, reviewed by NBC, show a pair of medics carrying a person on a stretcher to an ambulance. There were also police cars and fire crews at the scene, and here are 3 details that fueled all the speculation. First, a senior staff member from Lindsey Graham's office told NBC that there were no signs the senator was feeling unwell before his death. Second, a day before that, on July 10th, he was in Kiev. It was his 10th visit to war-torn Ukraine, and that's just during the full-scale war. And just a day before his death, he announced that he had finally secured White House approval for sanctions against Russia. And third, on Sunday morning, he was supposed to appear on the Meet the Press program on NBC itself. And in all his years in politics, he appeared on that show 63 times. Besides, he had just turned 71, his birthday was literally this past Thursday. A man who had no known health problems had just returned from Kiev and was planning to give an interview on NBC in the morning. And then this man dies of cardiac arrest on Saturday evening. And this exact set of facts creates what is called the perfect window for a disinformation campaign in information warfare, and the Russians immediately take advantage of it. The Russians jumped on this topic and took advantage of this perfect window for spreading disinformation. What did Lindsey Graham mean to Ukraine? During the full-scale war, he made 10 visits to Kiev. Zelensky, commenting on his death, specifically mentioned this, quote, Lindsey was a true defender of freedom and the values that make our world safer. We were in constant dialogue, which I will miss. In addition, Graham was the author of those very sanctions from hell against Russia. This was his main brainchild, and perhaps the most powerful weapon that the West unfortunately never got to use while he was alive. The bill gave the US president the authority to impose 500% tariffs on imports from countries that purchase Russian oil, gas, and uranium. Well, in other words, it didn't hit Russia itself. It went after the countries funding it. It targeted China, India, and, for example, Brazil. Lindsey Graham himself said that this bill would allow Trump, quote, to kick Putin's ass. And here's the most important part. Lindsey Graham finally got this bill approved literally a day before his death. On July 10 in Kiev, he announced that an agreement had been reached with the White House on the final version of this bill. This was his last political victory. And here's the next fact, which I'm sure you might not have even known. Lindsey Graham has been wanted in Russia since 2022. In his speech, he compared Vladimir Putin to Adolf Hitler and called on Russians to, quote, get rid of this guy. if they don't want to live in darkness, poverty, and isolation from the rest of the world. Basically, his words were prophetic. In May 2023, the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs put Lindsey Graham on a wanted list on criminal charges, and in February 2024, Rosfin Monitoring added him to the list of, quote, terrorists and extremists. And the last day before his death in Kyiv was also symbolic. Lindsey Graham visited the production facility of the Ukrainian defense company Skyfall, where he was shown heavy vampire bomber drones. That's the very same Baba Yaga FPV drones, the Shrike family of drones, and the interceptor drones Pisunpai and Vansan. In one of the latest photos, he is posing with a drone interceptor in his hands, and he stated that the US would make a huge mistake if it did not develop cooperation with Kyiv specifically in this area. And what's important is that Lindsey Graham was not some naive romantic. During the same visit on July 10, he stated that Russian troops unfortunately are unlikely to leave the captured territories so easily, and the goal of the US is an agreement that will prevent a future conflict. Moreover, any deal must be approved by Congress and secured with security guarantees for Ukraine. Continued. Today, American media describe Lindsey Graham's relationship with Donald Trump with one phrase, from calling him an ass to becoming his closest ally. Let me explain what that means. Let's follow the chronology here. In 2016, during the primaries, Lindsey Graham was one of Donald Trump's fiercest critics. He called him an ass, quote, a racist, xenophobic, religious fanatic, and the most flawed candidate in the history of the Republican Party. His famous tweet at the time went like this, quote, if we nominate Trump, we will get destroyed and we will deserve it. You know how to make America great again? Tell Donald Trump to go to hell. Trump responded in kind, calling Lindsey Graham an idiot. And the climax was when Donald Trump, right at the rally, read out Lindsey Graham's personal cell phone number to the whole crowd so they would start calling him and cursing him directly. The reason for the conflict was a matter of principle. Trump made the mistake of mocking John McCain, of all things, for being captured during the Vietnam War. And McCain was a close friend and mentor to Lindsey Graham. And that's why Lindsey Graham rushed to defend McCain's good name. But after Trump's victory, everything changed, and they were reconciled over lunch in March 2017. Well, by 2018, Trump and Graham had become regular golf partners. Graham himself explained the turnaround with disarming honesty. Quote, I called him a xenophobe, a racist, a religious fanatic, and I just ran out of adjectives. Well, the American people have spoken and rejected my analysis. He became one of Donald Trump's closest confidants, a key foreign policy advisor, especially on Iran and Russia, defended him during both impeachments, and pushed through his judicial appointments. But then there was another turn, yet another one. After the storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2021, Lindsey Graham publicly distanced himself, stating that the line had been completely crossed. But the break turned out to be temporary again, and by the time Trump returned to the White House, he was once again one of the administration's closest allies. And here is a key point, one that's very important for Ukraine. Despite his loyalty to Donald Trump, Lindsey Graham remained an interventionist and often disagreed with the isolationist wing of the Trump camp, that is, the isolationists in the Republican Party. He was exactly the bridge between Trump and the idea of supporting Ukraine. He knew how to package aid to Kyiv in language that Trump could understand. You know, he had this phrase, like, this isn't charity, it's a deal, it's a strong deal, it's a deal that will bring greatness to Trump and America and so on. And here's what Trump writes today, quote, Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the greatest people and senators I have known, has died. He always worked hard and was a true American patriot. And here we come to the most interesting part of this episode, how Russian propaganda handled the topic of Lindsey Graham's death. It's important to understand the mechanics, as they're subtler than they appear. Of course, there were no direct accusations of murder. No major Russian publication claimed Ukraine was to blame, that Ukraine poisoned Lindsey Graham, or that the CIA took him out. There were no such headlines. It's subtler than that. Russians always drop hints, which some people pick up on and then come up with their own version of the story. Russian propaganda constructs what's called an associative link in people's minds. Look at the headlines. I'll give you a few examples of headlines here. Met with Zelensky and died. The West is shocked by Graham's sudden death. Next headline. After visiting Kyiv, a U.S. senator recognized as a terrorist and extremist suddenly died. Or here's another one. Just returned from Kyiv and died. Graham's death caused a stir in the West. As you can see, none of the headlines claim Kyiv's involvement, but all three headlines create the same cause and effect chain in the reader's mind. He went to Kyiv, came back and died. And a classic propaganda technique is to have some foreigner say it, like, look, it's some Western official saying this, it's not something we made up. We're just referring to some Western official. Well, for example, RIA Novosti builds an entire article around a single social media post by the French far-right politician Florian Philippot. Not an American, this time they picked a French one. He was the one spreading the theory that Lindsey Graham didn't die after his visit to Kyiv by coincidence, so to speak. This is a classic example of legitimizing conspiracy theories through what they call an independent Western source. At the same time, Philippot immediately adds that the American senator was actually a staunch Russophobe. So it's strange to think that he was inconvenient for Kyiv, but Russians have simply overlooked and don't mention this part of the post. Or here's another example. Russian war correspondent Alexander Kots called the last photo of Lindsey Graham a cruel irony. Quote, "The last photo of the certified Russophobe holding a Ukrainian drone at a factory in Kyiv. And the funniest thing is that almost all Russian publications put an asterisk next to Lindsey Graham's last name. And then they add a footnote saying that he is included in the register of terrorists and extremists in the Russian Federation. Well, sorry, but that's dehumanization, plain and simple. Even in a posthumous obituary they inform the reader that it wasn't a person who died, it was a terrorist. An extremist recognized as such only by unwashed Russia. Here's the upshot of this mechanism. Facts aren't distorted by propaganda directly. They take a death, a visit, a date, so everything is true. But these facts are selected and pieced together in such a way that the reader comes to their own conclusion about a murder, an assassination, a poisoning, and so on. This allows propaganda to maintain plausible deniability. Like, listen, we didn't claim anything, we just reported the facts. And it's the people themselves who came up with something on their own. But what do the facts say against conspiracy theories? Well, since we're aiming for the full picture, let's be honest and present the arguments that conspiracy theorists still ignore. Lindsey Graham is 71 years old. He has a family history of heart-related death. His father died of a heart attack when Lindsey Graham was a student. His mother died of cancer around the same time. Both passed away less than 15 months apart. Graham was known as a workaholic who lived in a state of constant political stress. Trump, in his obituary, doesn't write by accident that Lindsey Graham was always working. Therefore, a sudden cardiac arrest in a 71-year-old man with a family history is, unfortunately, a statistically common event, not some kind of anomaly. And here's an important point: the lack of motive for the obvious suspect. The logic behind the Russian insinuation that he was supposedly eliminated in Kyiv falls apart with a simple question: why? Why? Lindsey Graham was one of Ukraine's most valuable assets in Washington. Just a day before his death, he coordinated with the White House on sanctions to cripple Russia's oil revenues. His death is a disaster for Kyiv and a gift for Moscow. Killing your own main lobbyist on the eve of his triumph, well, that's absurd. That's exactly why this version isn't stated outright in Russian reports. It doesn't hold up even to a superficial check. If you apply the favorite principle of conspiracy theorists, qui prodest in Latin, the result will be inconvenient for the authors of this fabrication. The main beneficiary of Lindsey Graham's death would be the one he spent his whole life working against, and that was Russia. What will happen now to those so-called hellish sanctions of Lindsey Graham against Russia? The good news is that the mechanism has already been launched and is not tied to one person. According to Graham, an agreement with the White House has been reached. The document has more than 80 co-authors in the Senate. That's enough even to overcome a presidential veto. Congressman Michael McCall said that he discussed the new sanctions bill with Graham just the day before on Saturday, right before Graham's death. So, accordingly, they plan to present this initiative in the coming days. The bad news is that Graham was not just a co-author, he was the driving force, the one who launched this initiative. He was the one who knew how to speak to Trump in his own language and push the Ukrainian issue through the resistance of isolationists within the Republican Party itself. As NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said, quote, "He was a powerful defender of America. He firmly believed in NATO, in the NATO alliance, and actively worked to put an end to Russia's war against Ukraine." It will be very difficult to replace such a person in the Senate, unfortunately, and this is probably Kiev's main loss at the moment. Conclusion. Unfortunately, a man who came to Kiev under rocket fire 10 times and was not afraid of it has passed away. He called the bold dictator Vladimir Putin the Adolf Hitler of our time. He came up with sanctions capable of collapsing Russia's oil revenues. And he died exactly at the moment when he got the White House to agree to them, and it must be admitted this is truly a great loss for Ukraine. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.